Have you ever felt like something inside you is holding you back, but you can't quite put a finger on it? Or maybe you have experienced a pain so deep, it's almost as if it lives in your bones. Trauma can look like that, and it can be so much more. Today, I'm talking to you about trauma in a way that you probably haven't heard before. This isn't just about the obvious event we often think of. Trauma has layers, hidden forms that can shape who we are without us even realizing it. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you might discover things about trauma you never knew, and even recognize how it shaped your life in ways you didn't expect. First category that we're going to talk about is acute trauma. Let's start with one of the most well-known types, acute trauma. This is one time, a single event that throws our world into chaos, like a car accident or a natural disaster or an unexpected assault. When you go through something like this, it shocks your system and your body responds with a flood of adrenaline, preparing you to fight, flight, or freeze. What a lot of people don't realize is that even one event like this can leave a lasting imprint, sometimes years after it has happened. And if you have ever felt that familiar jolt of fear, even in a completely safe situation, it might be your body remembering the trauma like an echo of the past. Chronic trauma, on the other hand, is where things get complicated. Unlike acute trauma, chronic trauma builds over time. It what happens when you are exposed to a constant stream of stress, like living in an abusive household, experiences ongoing bullying, or growing up in a neighborhood with a high level of violence. Your nervous system never really gets a break, so it stays on a high alert, always waiting for the next bad thing to happen. What's interesting and often surprising is that chronic trauma can change the way your brain works. Your brain actually rewires itself to prioritize survival over everything else, which is why things like trust, safety, and connection can feel so out of reach. It's as if the trauma reprogrammed you, and unless you actively work to unlearn the programming, it stays with you for a long period of time. Complex trauma. Let's go deeper with complex trauma. This isn't just one traumatic event or even ongoing event. Complex trauma is about growing up in a world where danger feels like a norm, often starting from a young age. Imagine a child growing up in an environment where they never feel safe, where emotional, physical, or sexual abuse is a regular occurrence. Complex trauma shapes you at its core. It can lead to challenges with emotional regulation, difficulty forming stable relationships, and a constant feeling of being disconnected from yourself. Many people with complex trauma struggle with identity, trust, and self-worth while in their adulthood. If any of these resonate with you, it might not be your fault and you're not alone. Complex trauma is challenging, but recognizing it is a powerful step toward healing. Vicarious trauma. Now here's a type of trauma you might not have heard about. Vicarious trauma. This happens when someone is repeatedly exposed to the trauma of other people, even if they haven't experienced it themselves, like healthcare workers, therapists, the first responders, and even family members of those who care about someone who's been through trauma can experience vicarious trauma. Imagine being a nurse in the ER, constantly seeing patients in crisis, or a therapist who listens to stories of abuse every day. Over time, these experiences can start to weigh on you. And as if the trauma is rubbing off on you, These symptoms are very real. Feelings of numbness, exhaustion, and sometimes even a sense of hopelessness. Vicarious trauma reminds us that just because we didn't live through a traumatic event ourselves, that it doesn't mean we are immune to its effect. Now, sanctuary trauma, here's a lesser known type, which is the sanctuary trauma. This type of trauma occurs when someone goes through to a place they believe will be safe, like a hospital or a police station or a counselor's office, and they end up even feeling even more traumatized by that experience. For example, think about someone who just experienced an assault, and they go to the police only to be questioned in a way that feels like they're on the trial. Or someone who goes to the ER looking for help, and they're met with indifference or even outright disbelief. When people feel rejected or judged in spaces that they're supposed to protect them, it can add another layer of trauma, one that cuts deep, because it feels like a betrayal. Generational trauma. Did you know that trauma can actually be passed down the generation? It's called generational trauma or transgenerational trauma, and it's been studied extensively. The research has shown that trauma can alter our DNA, which means that trauma experienced by our grandparents can influence the stress response, even if you have never experienced the same event that they did. Holocaust survivors' grandchildren, for example, often carry a high level of anxiety and sensitivity to stress. It's as if their body remembers something they have never personally experienced. This is more than just family stories or cultural tradition. It's a biological imprint of the trauma that is passed down, shaping each generation in ways that we are just beginning to understand. Hidden trauma. Trauma isn't always obvious. There are types of trauma that often goes unrecognized because it's hidden in plain sight. It's the trauma of living with chronic criticism, emotional neglect, or cultural discrimination, let's say. Hidden trauma doesn't always have a singular event attached to it, which is why it often goes unnoticed, even by a person experiencing it. This kind of trauma can make someone feel small, inadequate, or even invisible. Maybe you have grown up in an environment where love was conditional, or you were constantly made to feel not enough. These experiences don't look like trauma in the traditional sense, but they can have just as deep as an impact on you. They shape how you see yourself and how you show up in this world. Let's talk about collective trauma. Something the whole world has experienced over the past few years. Collective trauma happens when an entire community or a society goes through a traumatic event together, like a natural disaster or a war, and yes, a global pandemic. What makes collective trauma unique is that it doesn't just impact individuals, it impacts societies. It shapes our sense of morality, normancy, our connections with others, and even our trust in system and institutions. Collective trauma can lead to a shared sense of grief and a loss. It reminds us that sometimes trauma is something we experience not just as an individual, but as a collected society. It shows us that we're not alone, but it also challenges us to find new ways to heal together. Now, trauma is incredibly complex, and it impacts each of us in unique ways. Whether you have experienced a single traumatic event or carry a scar of generational pain, healing is possible. It starts with understanding. By learning about these different types of traumas, we can start to recognize them in ourselves and others, which is the first step toward breaking the cycle and finding peace.